In ancient days, different cultures hammered out coins of so many shapes and sizes that they were typically traded by weight. Some were made of wood or stone, but the most popular were made of metals. As I explained in the previous video, gold and silver have always been favourites. So in the old days, you'd put them on a scale and weigh them against some widely accepted standard. That worked well, but it was time-consuming to weigh them, so people discovered that making them in a few standard sizes was helpful, and embossing them with a number or a picture of someone famous helped people to be confident that the weight of each type of coin could be trusted. Now this is where history gets interesting, because somewhere along the line someone discovered a way to cheat. I'll use the Roman Empire as an example. As the empire grew by conquering its neighbours, it became more and more expensive to pay the army. They were running out of money. So as the government mined gold and silver and took in coins through taxation, they would melt them down and make smaller coins, but still with the same pictures and numbers on them. In this way they created more money from the same amount of metal and could pay the armies. As the coins circulated, the merchants complained that the newer coins were smaller and lighter than the old ones. So a law was passed that required the merchants to accept them at face value on pain of death. Knowing what we know about inalienable rights, we can see that such a law, a legal tender law, is unjust. It's a violation of inalienable rights. There were some unintended consequences too. People found that they could shave or clip bits from the edges of the coins and still spend the coins at face value. When they had enough shavings, they would melt them down, stamp out a few more coins, and spend those too. These words and ridges and artwork along the edges are intended to discourage the practice because it reveals when it has been done. Now, even though the Romans made their coins smaller and smaller, they still ran short of metal, so they started debasing the coinage. They melted down the gold and silver and mixed in cheaper metals such as lead, tin, iron, and copper. Unfortunately, the more they did this, the less attractive the coins became, so they started making them entirely out of cheaper metal and painted them with gold or silver. When they ran out of precious metal for that, they gave up painting them and flooded the economy with cheap metal. The value of the coins dropped below the point where it was worth hauling cartloads of them around, and people reverted back to barter. This was one of the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, at the same time, something else was going on, but it wasn't named until centuries later. This is very interesting. As the general population discovered that smaller and less desirable coins were being circulated, they tended to hoard the older ones. After all, if you have the choice of spending a big shiny coin that you've been guarding for years, or a small ugly coin that you just got that has the same face value, which one will you be more willing to part with? It is from the unearthing of the hoarded coins that the history has been pieced together. It turns out it wasn't a steady downward slide, of course. The Roman Empire was minting coins for hundreds of years, and there were numerous attempts to salvage the situation before the final disintegration. 1,000 years later, Henry VIII and his successor Edward VI debased England's coins until they were nearly worthless, just as the Romans had done. When conducting international trade, other countries insisted on pure metal. As England had lost its gold and silver, Sir Thomas Gresham observed that bad money drives out good. In recent centuries, this has come to be known as Gresham's Law, and we see it in operation today. It's the general tendency we all have to hoard the more attractive money and spend the junk. Now, what about paper money? Nearly every country has experimented with it over the centuries. It goes like this. Goldsmiths always have a safe place to keep the gold they were working on, such as a vault. Wealthy people arranged to leave their gold in the smith's vault. In return, the smith would issue them an IOU, which could be redeemed for an equivalent amount of gold upon demand. People soon discovered that the paper IOUs could be traded just like coins, and the smiths began to issue paper notes of standard denominations, and they became bankers. Now this part is fascinating. The bankers observed that the majority of the gold in their vaults never left, so they figured no one would notice if they printed a few more paper notes, maybe a few thousand of them, loaned them out, and collected the interest. Now this is highly controversial. Some will argue that this practice of printing multiple notes backed up by the same gold is acceptable and beneficial because it promotes faster economic growth, whereas others, such as myself, disagree and insist that the practice is dishonest. I think the phrase, taking money out of an inkwell, sums it up. But let's move on. This practice of printing extra notes puts a bank in a precarious position because when word gets out that the bank doesn't have sufficient gold to back up all the notes it has issued, customers panic and they race to the bank hoping to redeem their notes before all the gold is gone. This is called a run on the bank. Same thing can happen with savings accounts. The bank can find its gold reserves depleted before it can honor all of the IOUs, and it becomes insolvent or bankrupt. Something had to be done, so some banks were then designated as central banks and would keep a store of gold from member banks, and it could make an emergency loan to a bank in trouble. This works unless the central bank too runs out of gold. Almost from the day the first coin was produced, kings, emperors, and other forms of government have been involved because they need enormous sums to finance wars. In fact, it was nearly always those kings and emperors who started minting coins in the first place. To ensure that plenty of money is always available, governments write laws that enable themselves and the banks they control to do things that no one else is permitted to do. And just as one lie leads to another, governments typically end up forbidding any individual from freely creating his own bank or issuing his own money. And of course, when the government forbids something, it does so by threat of punishment, such as imprisonment or death. This, I submit, is another violation of inalienable rights. What we see today is that the coins minted by our government have been debased just as the Romans did. You can see these coins here are made of cheap metal and painted with silver. All the solid gold and silver coins have been driven out of circulation. Gresham's law. Do you think I'm going to spend these? No. Not so long as I can pass off these phony coins and bills at face value. This is why we so readily obey the legal tender laws. Everybody wants to get rid of the junk. Since President Nixon severed the last link to gold in 1971, the American dollar has been fiat. Fiat is Latin for let it be done, or it shall be. In other words, baseless, created out of thin air. As you can see, this dollar bill, this IOU, no longer promises to pay the bearer anything. It's a complete fraud. There's no shortage of information about the period following World War I, where the Weimar Republic of Germany, in an effort to repay the money it had borrowed from other countries and the damages it had caused during the war, started up its printing presses. Government got to spend the bills first, so it benefited the most, but the massive injection of cash into the economy caused prices to rise rapidly. Workers would collect their pay and race out to spend it on anything at all before it lost further value. People would buy anything they could find, no matter how useless, just to get rid of the paper money. Restaurants crossed out the prices on their menus because they had to raise the price of a meal before the patron could finish eating it. It eventually became cheaper to burn banknotes in the furnace than buy coal or firewood. This is a condition known as hyperinflation, where more and more money must be created to compensate for the deteriorating value of existing money. Government must keep printing more until the currency is not worth the paper it is printed on. And the whole scheme collapses like a house of cards. Fortunes are wiped out and honest men starve or become thieves. Eventually, government redenominates the currency. That is, they outlaw the old and issue new with fewer zeros on it, and the cycle starts again. The most notorious example I know of today is Zimbabwe. Their government has done it over and over. The country is one big train wreck with 90% unemployment. You can look it up. They use last year's money as wallpaper. The whole world watches dumbfounded, and only a handful of us understand the root cause. The economy of every country in the world today is based on fiat currency, and dozens of them have been periodically ruined or kept in a state of near ruin for centuries. You can look it up. Information is easily available. What we have in America today is a high-tech version of it. Most of the money exists only as numbers in electronic ledger sheets. Our government has, almost since its inception, been manipulating the economy in so many ways that economists have a difficult time explaining it. What we do know is that the vastly increased standard of living that we would expect to have following an industrial revolution has been stolen from us at a rate calculated to hide the theft. Through this gradual and surreptitious devaluation of the currency, we have been silently robbed of the riches we have worked so hard to earn. The scale of this crime defies comprehension. And remember, it has been done by none other than the agency that our ancestors created to protect us from such crimes. I'm certain that in every country, the damage that has been done by its government far exceeds that of individual back-alley counterfeiters. To get the idea, all you have to do is track the price of a common good, such as a loaf of bread. At the start of a cycle, it typically costs the smallest unit of money. A penny loaf of bread was typical in 1700. Today, with mass production and countless other improvements, I would expect to get at least 10 loaves of bread for a penny. But instead I pay about 400 pennies for one loaf. Some of the increase is due to taxes and regulations, and the rest is because enormous amounts of money have been created out of thin air. So is the development of paper money ever a normal occurrence? I seriously doubt it. I suspect it is purely a result of legally concealing a colossal fraud, with government, as usual, in the center of it. In my ideal world, legal tender laws would be repealed entirely and permanently. In the resulting free market, we could expect to see small transactions in gold and silver coins, and larger ones with bank checks, credit and debit cards, and so on, backed up by precious metals. I'm confident that no one would accept any kind of paper money, no matter what promise was printed on it. There would be no way to make paper money desirable, and the free market would reject it. For example, there is currently no law that says this grocery store is required to accept the play money from my Monopoly game. They would only accept it if they were forced to, just as they are currently forced to accept this equally baseless paper. Is it possible to return to precious metals as money? It's very difficult to do because governments are loath to repeal laws that work to their advantage. What can we conclude from that? It means, in the simplest possible terms, that every country in the world today is governed by thieves. A common objection is that there is so much money in circulation today that there isn't enough gold in the world to replace it. Of course there is. So what if the ratio turns out to be $100 million per ounce of gold? Certainly it would be a huge change to get used to, but we would. We would just use very small coins until more is dug out of the ground. Keep in mind that you don't really need that much gold. Most wealth is in the form of real estate and other durable goods. Money is only needed for trading. Now you might wonder if tiny coins are easy to misplace. Well, sure they are. But if they're valuable, people take care of them. I was astonished at the tiny silver coins I got when I changed my money into Swiss francs many years ago. Even though they were very small, they were so shiny and precious that I've been guarding them very carefully ever since. What I hope you got from this video is that we have the inalienable right to offer anything in trade, and the right to accept or refuse anything in trade. Laws that forbid the creation and use of any type of sound money are an improper use of force and constitute a violation of rights. Laws that enable a government to stamp out phony coins and pass off scraps of paper as though they were money and force its acceptance at face value are improper and constitute fraud. Is the US dollar heading for a crash? I'm convinced that it's inevitable, and currently too few of our elected representatives recognize that. I've been watching events accelerate for the last 30 years. It won't surprise me if we experience the same economic turmoil that other countries all over the world have suffered through and will impoverish us for generations to come. The only way I can see to stop this madness is to share the knowledge of inalienable rights with the entire country and vote for only those candidates who understand and respect rights.